My name is Tasha, and my life has always been shaped by my commitment to justice. As a Black woman with a career in internal affairs, I've worked tirelessly to expose corruption and wrongdoing, regardless of who it's coming from. But nothing could have prepared me for the battle I was about to face when my family's rights were violated in a place I thought we could call home. My mother, Linda, is a remarkable woman who's always been there for me. Due to health complications, she relies on a wheelchair to get around, and over the years, I've watched her struggle with a lack of independence. She's always been strong, but as time passed, it became more difficult for her to do simple things, like going out for fresh air or running errands. She deserved to live her life without feeling confined to the inside of our house. That's why we decided to have a wheelchair ramp installed in front of our home. It was a small adjustment that made a world of difference for her, and I was proud to do it. We live in a predominantly white neighborhood, where we've often felt like outsiders. My mother and I have always been conscious of our place in the community, but we've tried to focus on what really matters: our family, our values, and our home. Yet there's always been an undercurrent of discomfort when it comes to how we're perceived. We've made peace with this dynamic because we love our house and our life together. But our sense of belonging was about to be shattered by someone we least expected. Enter Debbie, a member of our homeowners association (HOA), who has made it clear she believes in her superiority. Her attitude reeks of privilege, entitlement, and an unhealthy dose of racism. She believes her position within the HOA gives her the power to impose her views on anyone she chooses, regardless of how harmful those views may be. I've seen her glaring at us from across the street, making passive-aggressive comments under her breath about my mother's wheelchair, about that unsightly ramp, and even about us living in the neighborhood. But until that day, I hadn't seen her take any real action, until now. I came home from work one evening to find my world turned upside down. The ramp that had given my mother freedom was destroyed, reduced to rubble. My heart sank as I looked at my mom, who was sitting at the window, unable to move. She had no way of leaving the house without help. And in that moment I felt helpless. When I confronted Debbie, she didn't seem to care. In fact, she laughed in my face, mocking my distress. She dismissed my concerns with a cold and cruel tone, claiming that the ramp ruined the neighborhood's aesthetic. She then had the audacity to say that people like us shouldn't even be living here in the first place. Those words were a punch to the gut, and I realized that this wasn't just about a ramp. It was about hatred and racism that had been allowed to fester under the surface. Debbie wasn't content with just destroying the ramp. She was determined to make our lives miserable. The damage she'd done was already severe, but she was just getting started. It didn't take long before rumors about my mother's wheelchair ramp spread through the neighborhood, fueled by Debbie's words. She began telling neighbors that the ramp was against HOA rules, and she painted a picture of us as unwelcome intruders. She didn't even hide her racism anymore, and it was obvious that this was her way of pushing us out. I could feel the tension building as she continued to spread her lies, and soon the HOA began sending us violations. The letters started to arrive almost daily. Each one was more threatening than the last, warning us of fines, potential legal action, and the very real possibility of losing our home if we didn't comply with their demands. Debbie had turned the HOA into her personal weapon, using it to punish my mother and me for simply existing in the neighborhood. It became clear that she thought she was untouchable, protected by her position and the supposed power she held over others. The worst part was seeing how other members of the HOA rallied around her, seemingly blind to the racial undertones of her actions. It was as if they were all too afraid to speak out, or worse, too comfortable with the status quo to care. At first I was livid. How could anyone be so callous and cruel? But I quickly realized that if I was going to stand up to Debbie, I had to be strategic. As an internal affairs investigator, I've spent my career uncovering corruption, and I knew that this situation demanded the same level of precision. I kept my emotions in check, carefully documenting every conversation, every letter, and every piece of evidence that could expose Debbie for the racist she was. It was crucial to remain calm and methodical because in my line of work I knew that emotion could cloud judgment. As the HOA meetings dragged on, it became harder to stay calm. Debbie would strut around like she was untouchable, continuing to spread her lies. She made snide comments about us and tried to manipulate others into siding with her, while the HOA members seemed too afraid or too complicit to challenge her. But with each passing day I knew I was getting closer to my goal. I was compiling the evidence, and I wasn't going to let Debbie get away with this. My mother deserved better, and so did the rest of the neighborhood. We were living under the thumb of a racist, and I wasn't going to let that go unchallenged. The stakes had grown too high, and I wasn't backing down. The moment I decided to take action was when I realized I was facing more than just a petty HOA dispute. This wasn't about a ramp. It was about a larger, more insidious issue of systemic racism and corruption that had been allowed to fester for far too long. I was determined to expose Debbie for what she truly was. Not just a racist bully, but someone whose influence had been used to destroy lives and manipulate the system. And I had the tools to do it. As an internal affairs investigator, my job is to uncover secrets and root out corruption. It didn't take long for me to realize that Debbie was far from the average HOA member. I began digging into her history, starting with public records. What I found made my blood boil. Debbie had been involved in multiple shady practices during her time with the HOA. Her discrimination wasn't just limited to my family. She had a pattern of pushing out Black and minority families from the neighborhood, using her position to manipulate property deals, force unfair sales, and drive down home values to benefit herself. I was seeing a clear, consistent pattern of behavior. But it didn't end there. The more I dug, the more I uncovered. I started talking to neighbors who had been forced to sell their homes under duress, all of whom had similar stories of Debbie using her position to pressure them into unfair property transactions. The extent of her involvement in illegal practices became clear. Not only was she using her HOA role to discriminate, but she was also embezzling funds from the association, funneling money into her own pockets through bogus property deals. This discovery was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I finally had the evidence I needed to take her down. But I couldn't act recklessly. I needed everything to be airtight. I couldn't just confront her with accusations. I needed undeniable proof. So I continued to quietly gather more evidence. I reached out to other residents who had been impacted by her actions, earning their trust and encouraging them to come forward with their stories. Each new witness added another layer of credibility to the case I was building against Debbie. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. Debbie wasn't just a racist HOA Karen. She was a calculated individual who had been exploiting the system for years. But the worst part was realizing how many people in the neighborhood had been complicit in turning a blind eye to her actions. I wasn't just fighting for my family anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had been hurt by her, for every person who had felt the weight of her discrimination, for every marginalized individual who had been driven out of the community she had long claimed as her own. With all my pieces in place, I knew it was time to act. I wasn't going to let her continue to destroy lives and get away with it. I had enough to destroy her career, her reputation, and her grip on the HOA. But more than that, I was going to expose the rot at the core of our community and show everyone the truth about who Debbie really was. The day of the HOA meeting finally arrived, and I knew it was the moment I'd been preparing for. I had all my evidence ready. Every document, every recording, and every witness statement that would prove Debbie's racism, corruption, and abuse of power. I wasn't just going to expose her for what she did to my family. I was going to show the entire neighborhood who she really was. I arrived at the meeting early, keeping my calm as I set up my presentation. I knew that once I started, there would be no turning back. The room slowly filled with HOA members, some of whom I recognized and others who were more unfamiliar. But all of them would soon learn the truth. As the meeting began, I stood up, my voice steady and clear as I addressed the group. I started with Debbie, laying out her racist behavior toward my family, the destruction of my mother's wheelchair ramp, and her blatant disregard for basic human decency. But that was just the beginning. I pulled up the records I'd uncovered, documents detailing Debbie's history of pushing minority families out of the neighborhood through illegal property transactions. I showed how she'd been embezzling HOA funds to line her own pockets, using her position to orchestrate fraudulent deals. I presented testimonies from residents who had been bullied into selling their homes or pressured into accepting unfair offers. Each piece of evidence I presented chipped away at the image Debbie had carefully constructed for herself. As the room grew silent, Debbie's face turned pale. She didn't know how to react at first. She tried to interrupt me, dismissing my findings as lies and baseless accusations, but I wasn't about to let her deflect. I calmly continued to present the facts, one after the other, until there was nothing left to hide. It was as if the walls were closing in on her with each new revelation. Debbie, however, wasn't going down without a fight. She tried to turn the tables, claiming that I was just trying to ruin her good name. She insisted that I was fabricating everything, accusing me of being vengeful and overreacting. But the more she spoke, the more ridiculous her claims seemed. No one in the room could deny what they were hearing, and soon others began to speak up. Neighbors who had been too afraid to challenge Debbie in the past started to back me up, sharing their own stories of how she had treated them. It was no longer just my word against hers. It was a community's collective experience of her cruelty. Despite her best attempts to save face, it was clear that Debbie's reign of terror was coming to an end. She couldn't hide behind her manipulative tactics anymore. Her denial was weak and the truth was undeniable. As the meeting went on, I kept my composure, refusing to let her bait me into losing my cool. This wasn't about me getting personal satisfaction. It was about making sure that justice was served. I'd done the work. I had the evidence. And as Debbie's facade crumbled before the entire HOA, I knew that I had already won. The aftermath of my confrontation with Debbie was swift and explosive. Once the truth about her actions became public knowledge, it didn't take long for the community to react. Local news stations picked up the story and soon the entire neighborhood was buzzing with outrage. Debbie, once seen as a prominent member of the HOA, was now exposed as a racist and corrupt figure. The community that had allowed her to wield such power for years now saw her for what she truly was: an individual who had used her position to discriminate, manipulate, and exploit others for her own gain. The media coverage intensified as more details emerged. They reported on Debbie's long history of racial discrimination, the illegal property deals she had orchestrated, and the money she had funneled into her own pockets through fraudulent schemes. The community had been living under her shadow for far too long, and now they were finally waking up to the damage she had caused. People were furious, not just for what she did to my family but for the countless other individuals she had hurt over the years. Her reputation as a community leader was in tatters, and she had no one left to support her. As the public outcry grew, the authorities were forced to take action. An investigation was launched into her financial dealings and her discriminatory practices. It wasn't long before charges of racial discrimination and embezzlement were brought against her. Her empire crumbled. The job she had once used to exert control over her neighbors was gone, and the friends and allies who had once supported her turned their backs. Even the HOA board, which had been complicit in ignoring her actions, began to distance themselves from her. Debbie, once untouchable in the community, now found herself alone, facing the consequences of her actions. But for me, this wasn't just about seeing Debbie fall. It was about the broader impact on our neighborhood. It was about restoring a sense of justice and showing that the actions of one person shouldn't be allowed to tear a community apart. As her world came crashing down, I finally had the space to focus on what truly mattered: my mother. The stress that had consumed our lives for so long was starting to ease. I had the ramp rebuilt, stronger and better than before. My mom could finally move around freely without the constant fear that someone would tear it down again. And slowly the neighborhood began to heal. People who had once turned a blind eye to Debbie's actions started coming together to support each other, to rebuild trust, and to ensure that no one else would be allowed to wield that kind of power again. I was hailed as a hero by many, not just for my work in internal affairs, but for having the courage to stand up to someone who thought she could get away with hatred and manipulation. But I wasn't looking for recognition. I was simply relieved that my mother could finally live in peace. As Debbie's life continued to unravel, I could see the full scope of her destruction. Her reputation was irreparably damaged, and the legal consequences of her actions were inevitable. She had alienated everyone who had once been her ally, and the weight of the charges against her was impossible to ignore. In the end, she faced the justice she had so long avoided, facing criminal charges for her racist acts, her fraudulent schemes, and the harm she had caused to so many innocent people. Her career was destroyed and she had nowhere left to hide. For me, the victory wasn't just in seeing Debbie punished. It was in knowing that I had fought for something bigger than myself. My mother and I could finally breathe easy. We were no longer under the oppressive weight of someone who thought they could control us. Our lives, once filled with fear and tension, were now moving forward without the shadow of Debbie looming over us. The ramp was rebuilt, stronger than ever, and we were finally free to live without harassment. In the months that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The sense of division that had plagued us for so long started to fade. People who had once been too afraid to speak out against Debbie's influence began to come together, building a community that was stronger and more united than ever before. The healing process wasn't immediate, but it was real. The wounds Debbie had inflicted were deep, but they were not permanent. And for me, this wasn't the end of my fight for justice. It was only the beginning. I had seen firsthand how corruption, racism, and hatred could tear a community apart, and I was determined to continue fighting for what was right, wherever it was needed. For my mother, for my neighbors, and for everyone who had suffered at the hands of people like Debbie, I would keep pushing for change. This was just one victory, but it was a victory that proved justice could still prevail no matter the obstacles in the way.